Hello, this is Todd Pierce. I'm the Acting Director of Communications at Truman. Today, as part of our observance of Human Rights Day 2020, we're going to be talking to Jan Krc. Jan is somebody who is hugely important to me and to many other LGBT people in the national security establishment, somebody whose case resulted in the end of the Lavender Scare, which targeted thousands of LGBT people in the national security establishment over decades. Jan here talks about the revocation of his security clearance when he was a second tour officer. He talks about working with Frank Kameny in the ACLU when he fought back, and about co-founding the affiliate group Gays and Lesbians in Foreign Affairs Agencies, which remains active to this day. Enjoy. Jan Krc, thank you very much for talking to us today in honor of LGBT History Month. So first of all, how are you doing amid all the coronavirus craziness?
I'm doing fine. It's great to see you, Todd. I have no complaints. I'm retired now, but keeping busy.
You know, how did you get interested in foreign affairs? A little about your family story. Yeah, let's hear it.
Well, as the name would give me away, I'm of Czech background, born in Prague, and my family left in the late 60s, right at the time of the Prague Spring and the Soviet invasion. When the first big event in your life is such a dramatic move from, behind the Iron Curtain to the United States, you kind of have to notice international affairs because you're part of it. And so that Prague Spring and the invasion made a big impression on me, although I was only about 11 at the time. But I think that sort of bicultural, bilingual background was already the beginnings of my interest in the sort of international relations and studying languages, which is what I did from then on.
And your family went where?
We ended up like good immigrants, you go where you know somebody. So we had relatives, an uncle of mine teaching at Yale. So we ended up in New Haven, Connecticut.
Yeah, so then I think you were at Hopkins Grammar for a while and then decided to go to Wesleyan, right? Undergrad?
That's
and
right.
What did you study there?
I majored in European history, modern European history, which even at the time didn't seem very practical, but in many ways, I think it was a perfectly good preparation for the Foreign Service.
I get this question all the time, people asking me like, oh, if I want to enter the Foreign Service, what should I study? So do you have any recommendations on that score? Like, are you glad you did a kind of classic liberal arts education?
I am, but at the same time, I recognize that it can be varied. I mean, we really are generalists, and so you don't have to be an international relations, major and expert, to get into the Foreign Service, as we probably, I'm sure that's what we all tell people, and it's true. It's general, but I think a liberal arts education would do you well in that field, and history obviously works, but so does lots of other things, law and literature, right, and so forth. It's all part of it.
Okay. And then did you go straight into Fletcher, or did you take any time off?
I did, which looking back now, I would counsel against that. I think that was one of the things that I would do differently. Not that I regret it terribly, but I think it would have been a good idea to take that year off or so between college and graduate school, because to me, graduate school, although a lot of fun, being a student in Boston at that time was great. Maybe coming out of the closet helped too. But it felt like a continuation of college. And I think if I had done something more practical, an internship or Peace Corps or something for a year, it would have directed the graduate study more.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about something that I remember really well. I remember being interested in the State Department sort of in a very fuzzy way. And I thought, oh, that would be interesting, but they're not going to take somebody like me. Did you have a different experience?
No, I had some of the same fears that you did, because I was, perfectly aware of my orientation. But I took the USIA thinking, unfortunately, in retrospect, falsely, that would be the safer place to go for someone like me, precisely because, political military might be a little dicey in terms of security clearances, but USIA, if you're doing cultural educational policies and programs and exchanges, why would they care if you're gay?
Right.
As it turns out, they cared more than their State Department colleagues did.
Right. And then you came into the Foreign Service the first time in 82. Okay, so 1982, Obviously a very different world. It's the beginning of the AIDS crisis,
The evil empire
and then were there other out people? Were there other gay people in your JOT, in your intake class? Was there any group that was formed or any sense of like kind of networking or?
Believe me, I was looking. I would have loved to have met people, but it was very much don't ask, don't tell. It
Right.
was never spoken of. None of the briefings, all those weeks of briefings, and it used to be longer back then, never came up. Never, nobody dared ask questions about it. Needless to say, I didn't either. So there was no organization. There was no role model to look up to and figure out how to be gay in the foreign service. There's just nothing to go by. You basically kind of committed yourself to a lifestyle where you knew that that would have to be kept very separate, very, very underground.
Yeah. And then your first assignment was?
Yugoslavia, a country that no longer exists. But I, as an Eastern European specialist, even back then, because I had languages, I had Russian, Czech. So I thought I lucked out because I actually got to one country in Eastern Europe that would have been open, that wouldn't have been Soviet. And so I felt very lucky.
And then what did you do there?
I had a year-long rotation. Basically, you were over complement. So you were a junior officer, but you were passed around different sections as an extra body. So you were exposed. So I spent, a couple months in the consular section, political econ. So anyway, so that was a full year of that. And then my follow-on assignment was actually going to be in Cape Town. All my things were transferred there. And I should have gone directly from Belgrade to Cape Town, but foolishly, I insisted on a trip back to the States. I didn't have much background in Africa, but I took seriously the worldwide availability. And so if Africa is next, then fine, I'll do it, but I thought, let's get some training for it. And so I insisted on the trip back, and that's when my troubles began.
Right. It's now 1984. Okay, and this is where things start. So what exactly happened?
I had a very successful assignment in Yugoslavia, no problems, but while I was a graduate student, CIA was an option that I considered. So I had an interview with them while at Fletcher in graduate school. They were interested, oh, you speak Russian, great, Czech, wonderful. We'd love to have you, but you have to take a polygraph test. Mm-hmm. And are there any issues like alcohol or drugs that you need, you'd want to discuss before we put you on the polygraph? And I said, I don't have any problems. I never touched any drugs. I didn't even drink back then. And so I then foolishly, naively, this goes to show, liberal arts, lefty kind of background in Connecticut. I said, well, as long as you don't mind my being gay, then, there are no issues really to discuss on the polygraph. Well, one of the two gentlemen, there were two of them, dropped his cigarette, saying I'm gay. It was just the end of the interview. Unfortunately, this little stunt of mine meant that years later, they connected that interview to the report of my trip to Romania. With a name like mine, it wasn't easy to make the connection. And so that's what they had on me. And so basically, when I came back to Washington for that little stopover en route to Cape Town, I got called in by security, and that's the basis of the interrogation that followed.
What was that experience? I mean, it must have just been an overwhelming experience, right?
It was shattering. It was, well, first of all, I mean, to be blunt, I lucked out a lot. I mean, talk about white privilege. I was a lucky, I considered myself to be pretty lucky, and I was lucky, and I had everything easy and going my way. So suddenly to meet this reversal and this sort of feeling like, my God, I'm being judged on something I can't help. And so that's what got me sort of thinking, I need to fight this. My parents didn't leave Eastern Europe and communism only to end up in another country where, we're going to be pushed around like this. The few closeted people that were in the service that I knew, they basically kind of said, my God, why did you tell them anything? But my feeling was always, I bought the argument that, you're a security risk if you are covering it up. Mm-hmm. So if you don't cover it up, then you're not a security risk. But unfortunately, USIA had this wonderful formulation which said, yeah, sure, you're a security risk if you're closeted because you can be blackmailed, but you're also a security risk if you're out of the closet because you are of, and I quote to this day, of higher susceptibility to hostile intelligence approaches. And so it was a frightening time. I mean, I remember losing a lot of weight and just being totally just destroyed by it almost,
Yeah.
because there was this profession that I really wanted. I had no other plans for anything else. And suddenly it was all kind of destroyed. I think I was aided a little bit by the times changing already. So it wasn't quite the 50s or the 60s. So the atmosphere was a little better. Also, there was sort of the Foreign Service colleagues were really generally supportive. Unlike my parents, whose attitude was very much, well, now that, with this handicap, you can't represent the country, so they were more of that school, although they've come around since, so I have to give them credit for growth. But it was just this sense of this should not be allowed to happen, not in the America that we escaped to. It was so overwhelming, and financially it would have been so ruinous that I couldn't have really fought this, except for the intervention of Frank Kameny, whom I met earlier at some fundraiser. And he really saved the day because he got me in touch with the ACLU, and the ACLU took on the case. But without that support, I'm afraid I would have to have done what hundreds of others have done before me in the Foreign Service, which is just give up and go away. But I didn't find that acceptable.
So what happens around 1986 or so?
Okay, let's go back a little bit. I was initially accused of misconduct in Yugoslavia, which was bogus. So they took it back and they said, well, we're not accusing you of any misconduct. We simply can't clear you for overseas service. Your security clearance is only limited to Washington. We'll simply transfer you into domestic service where your clearance will hold and you can just go on with your life. And so at that point, I said, no, I don't accept that. And I did take it to the grievance board at that point. So I was grieving this transfer into the domestic service. And that I still did with the union lawyer, AFG, American Federation of Government Employees. But once the case started, they basically said, we can't take on major litigation like this. So that's when I really had to get some outside help. And that's where Frank Kameny came in. And this all happened in 1985, so a year after the whole thing started. And so by 1986, to answer your question, the board, the Foreign Service Grievance Board, picked by the Secretary of State, so this would have been, a Republican picked body. So this panel was not exactly, gay friendly, but basically they ruled in my favor, surprise, surprise, unanimously. And at that point, we celebrated too early because, of course, the government then turned around, or security, I should say, and went to the director, Wick, who was the director of the U.S. Information Agency, and basically convinced him to take it to a federal court. So they claimed national security would be somehow imperiled if I got back into the Foreign Service. So the government side was the one who took it to a federal court, district court. And that was the next stage. And that took another 2 years, but basically agreed with the government that, if they somehow can't clear me for overseas assignments, so be it. It's their judgment call. And essentially that's what the case was all about, was whether or not their decisions can be adjudicated. And we, of course, argued that, equal protection is being violated. And so, you do have to look at whether or not their decision is violating civil rights. But unfortunately, back in the 80s, that need to review something like that didn't extend to gays.
And I think there's something so Kafkaesque about that. If gays are closeted, that means that they can be blackmailed. But if they're out, then there's still a heightened risk. I mean, it was like you can't win either way.
And the amazing thing, and that's actually why the ACLU, I think, was so eager to take the case, because in most discrimination cases, it's very difficult to actually just come out and show, they discriminate, because the discrimination is hidden, it's veiled. But in this case, it was explicit. I mean, the head of security, who does control who gets to work in the agency or doesn't, says these people, by definition, in the closet, out of the closet, don't belong in the Foreign Service. It's exactly what the ACLU wanted, a clear-cut case, and I think they had it. In the end, we lost the case. People always forget that, and I sometimes forget it, because in the end, this explicit discrimination was just ignored. Now, mind you, any member of any kind of minority does have that in the back of his or her mind. I mean, we're not the only ones who are, in danger.
So tell us, 1988, 90, where are we now with your case?
What happened was the district court, Judge Ritchie, we lost after 2 years. We then had to appeal, the ACLU on my behalf, appealed to the Court of Appeals. We got 2 Carter leftovers and 1 Reagan judge, Ginsburg. And so it was a 2-to-1 decision in my favor. And basically the court said, equal protection was ignored here. They sent it back to the district court to redo. Well, unfortunately, when you go back, you get the same judge you had going up. So we got Judge Ritchie again, the Nixon appointee,
Right.
not very happy to see us in court again, in his court. So he sat on it for 2 years and then ruled exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
We had to go back up to the Court of Appeals, but we lost one of the Carter judges, Mikva. And so all of a sudden it became a 2-to-1 going the other way against us.
And then what happens next in the story?
So we are now in the early 90s, and the last step, of course, was the Supreme Court. And so this is 93 already. So this is just as I was getting back into the Foreign Service. So we basically appealed to the second Court of Appeals decision to the Supreme Court. They sat on it for 1 year. They were the quickest, and they basically didn't grant cert. In other words, they just chose not to take it. With that, the lower court decision stood. But then, as I said, my troubles began with security because they basically went after me. They got the FBI involved. Mm-hmm. And let me tell you, there's nothing more excruciating than having a bunch of FBI agents show up at your workplace and basically tell your supervisor he is not to be allowed to have any access to classified information. He's under a national security investigation. And oh my God, we don't like what's happening. We're going to step on this guy and we're going to just scare him off. And, he might have passed the exam, but, we've got to be, we're going to take care of him. And they tried. They really did. Even when I got back into the Foreign Service, the question was it going to be state or USIA?
Right.
I had to go to state because USIA wouldn't let me. I mean, they were just so caught up with this case and wanting to prove that they were right.
So tell us a little bit about founding the first organization for gays and lesbians in foreign affairs agencies. And that was 1992, 91?
Yeah, early 90s, yeah. Well, I mean, it goes back to this problem of, you feel like you're the only one who's ever gone through this. Over the years, though, of the court battle, I just ran into a lot of cases, a lot of people that, were kicked out. A number of us who went through some of this thought, wait a minute, we need to share this information. We need to get together. We need to organize. We need to be more systematic. Otherwise, we will always be on the losing side. And so it happened over Sunday brunch, like many, gay things. And as we argued about the name, I preferred Foreign Affairs Gays, but the acronym was too much. So we came up with GLIFA. The mentorship was extremely important. And that's one of GLIFA's great achievements, I think, because prior to GLIFA, there was no one to turn to. There were plenty of gay people, but especially the senior ones were so afraid to be in any way identified as such that they would stay away from you if you were somewhat more open than they were. There was resistance and there were problems to iron out, but that was GLIFA's great achievement to make it, worldwide available, the information, the contacts. Early on, I think we started the whole sort of GLIFA representatives at each post, or at least whenever possible. And that really helped. I mean, to have an officer arrive and, to meet a GLIFA representative who can then brief him or her on what to expect, what to look out for. Very, very useful because, nobody else will do that for you. They're not going to tell you about gay attitudes at the post because
exactly
they don't think about it.
Yeah.
We started something that was ahead of even the liberal Western Europeans, the idea that advocacy for gay rights overseas, that was a great achievement. And I hope that we get back to that one of these days.
What do you see now? Are you worried about the situation now?
I'm extremely, extremely worried. I think the Schedule F idea is a horrific idea. It's just a dreadful idea to suddenly make, all the mid to high level positions be basically political appointees. I mean, one of the things we always stressed overseas to our audiences was that no matter who gets elected, there's certain things that will remain. I did not join the Foreign Service to be a Democratic Foreign Service officer or a Republican one. And I really resent this push towards that, which is what this administration is doing. It's a sad thing. I mean, I think we're still I mean, we should stand for human rights around the world. That was always one of the key, tenets of our foreign policy advocacy, certainly as a USIA officer. And I see that kind of disappearing now. This whole transactional, like what's in it for us? I always thought that we stand for more. I mean,
Right.
That's one of the reasons why I joined, because I thought we represent something far higher level, noble than just transactions.
Yes. So my final question is, because this is LGBT History Month, is looking back on the whole saga. Let's say you could go back and talk to yourself like at Wesleyan or at Fletcher. Like, would you do this whole thing again?
Oh, you bet. Oh, for sure. For sure. And I would still come out during that 9-hour interview. I don't regret that one bit. In fact, when I got back in, I was counseled by many of my closeted friends. Well, this time around, of course, you're going to be, a little bit less open and so forth. I said, hell no. Oh, no. I didn't go through 10 years of litigation to go back into the closet. It's a great career choice. I still believe that. I would still choose it. I still advise young people who are thinking about what to do after college or graduate school, try for the Foreign Service. So I still believe in it very much. I think I probably talked too much, so I'll leave it at that. But it's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed our talk.
Yeah. Thanks again.
Thank you.